Scripture's already been read for you this morning. Scripture's been read for you this morning, Philippians chapter 1. We're looking at verses 12 through 26 over the next couple of weeks. We read for you this morning verses 12 through 18. I want to share with you right at the beginning something I think that is so important for us as we've just been in the last couple of weeks through the holidays, just preparing you for this series. Now we're going to get into the depth of it. Now we're going to get into the meat of it. Now we're going to look at it verse by verse, scripture by scripture, of what Paul meant and what Paul felt. It was in the bottom of the sixth inning in 1989. The Montreal Expos' most feared hitter, Tim Raines, was at the plate. The pitcher glared at the catcher, and then he checked the runner on first base. Then, kicking high, he pushed off the rubber and threw as hard as he could. It was the last pitch that he would ever throw. A loud, sickening crack was heard all over the stadium. Weakened by an undiscovered cancer, the humerus bone in his pitching arm had snapped in two. This pitcher said later, at that moment, my arm felt like I'd been hit with a meat axe. He grabbed his arm to keep it from flying toward home plate as he screamed, tumbling head first to the ground. While his baseball career was over, his adversity had just begun. After many examinations, the doctors told him that his pitching arm would have to be amputated at the shoulder to guarantee that the cancer would not spread to other parts of his body. In 1991, that surgery took place. This pitcher's name is Dave Dravecky, formerly of the San Diego Padres, was traded to the San Francisco Giants. I really can't imagine what Dave must have felt at the reality of that news when it actually set in. He was in the prime of his career. He was an extremely gifted athlete who took very good care of his body. Under normal circumstances, he had many good years left in his Major League Baseball career. But he was also a growing Christian. He and his wife had a deeper hunger for spiritual things, and that was becoming very evident in his life. His courageous comeback to pitch again before that incident was against the Cincinnati Reds. And in 1989, after they realized that he had a lump on his arm, they took an operation and removed it. And he came back in 1989 and he pitched 8 innings and won that game against the Cincinnati Reds. 8 days later, he would pitch again. And that is the day that this incident took place, where he was in the bottom of the sixth inning, and all of a sudden his life had changed. I want you to watch this video now. Before I come back, I want you to watch the video of this man's testimony of what God has been doing in his life.
By September of that year, a lump had developed on the outside of my left arm that was now half the size of a golf ball. I'm getting ready for spring training in 1981, and the next thing you know, I'm traded in spring training with 2 days left to the San Diego Padres. But you know what was really cool? It was there that I met my roommate, Byron Ballard, and Byron became the guy in my life that challenged me to read the Bible. August 27th, 1981, my wife and I were baptized by Roy Wheeler. It was, of all places in Amarillo, Texas, the most beautiful place in the universe for Jan and I, and the most amazing experience of our life that began a journey that has been a very interesting journey, to say the least. getting to the big leagues and now being a Major League ball player, experiencing an all-star game in the World Series, and then getting traded from the San Diego Padres, which were a last-place team, to the first-place Giants, and going into postseason play in '87 against the Cardinals and pitching the two best games of my life. And I thought, man, 1988 is going to be my year. We're sitting there, and the doctors on the outside of the room start flipping the films under the lights to examine them. And all of a sudden, we heard one of the guys say, "Man, this is a tumor." And my heart went into my throat. I said, look, I can't sit back and forget about, at least attempting to come back. I don't want to live the rest of my life wondering. I went to the bullpen and there was a standing ovation. I was like, wait a minute, man, I'm just Dave Dravecky. And then I get out to the mound and I'm just overwhelmed by all these things that are happening. And the game starts and I complete 8 innings. In this victory against the Cincinnati Reds. It's a couple hours before the game, sitting there talking with Bob Knepper over pregame lunch, and we start talking about the comeback and how awesome it was and this incredible miracle. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting there and he looks at me and he goes, "I hate to burst your bubble, man, but it's not the miracle of the comeback here that's so important." He said, "It's the miracle of salvation. It's the day you met Jesus that is so important in all of this. And what God has done is given you a platform through baseball to share His love with those who hurt." And 5 hours later, I'm laying on the ground with a broken arm. And all I could hear were Bob Knepper's words. The cancer reoccurred. There were more surgeries. With each surgery, there were less and less margin to be able to remove anything, because now they were down to bone. And I felt so much pressure to be an example for others. I entered into an identity crisis. I went into clinical depression. Then I became a very angry man because I did not know how to deal with these emotions that I had pushed and pushed and pushed. It was horrible. As a result of some really good friends who loved me in spite of my behavior, God began to heal. And it's hard even to admit those things, but there's been great healing in being able to expose the lies of my life, the hiddenness of my life. Because in that freedom, I've come face to face with true grace. That love that comes even on my worst day. The most loving, the most gracious, the most understanding, the most encouraging, the most forgiving person in the universe and in my life.
As many of us that are present here today have discovered, the real test for Christians comes when you find yourself under the pressure of life. Or under persecution. Dave Dravecky came back to his fans to say thank you for all the cards and letters. But he also took the opportunity to share his faith in his Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And so it was, when you look at this book that is in front of us in Philippians, Paul, when he refers to the Philippian church in the 12th verse of the first chapter, there's a phrase there that I want you to keep in your minds as we go through this series. And that phrase is right there in verse 12 when it says that the things which happened unto me. He was reminding the Philippians that he had experienced some difficult days. He had gone through some deep troubles. Paul's explanation of the situation here in the first chapter is not detailed for us. It's very brief, but if you study the book of Acts, you learn that the trouble that he went through is exactly what he's talking about here in verse 12. Because the book of Acts, you know, is the history of the New Testament. And most of the epistles that you study from Paul are greatly enhanced by the study of the book of Acts. Because the book of Acts helps us to fill all the empty places where we can't figure out what's going on in Paul's writings. For instance, we learn a great deal about the establishment of the church of Philippi when you study the book of Acts in chapter 16. If you've studied that before, you know exactly what I'm about to say. For 2 years, Paul had been a prisoner in Caesarea. Now he was a prisoner in Rome. Because Paul knows that the believers in Philippi who really loved him are deeply concerned about his welfare. And that's what we were talking about the last couple of weeks. The joy of community. The joy of knowing that we have each other. Folks, if there's ever a time, as I've said, I can't stress it enough, if there's ever been a time that we need each other, it's now. We don't need to beat up on our own. We don't need to shoot our own. We need to love each other. And we need to encourage each other. Because it's us that are going to help one another get along in this life and finish the race that God has set out before us. We need each other. And that's what we've been talking about. That's why this church, our members, our guests, our friends, that's why it's important that we keep Emmanuel Baptist Church exactly the way God intends it to be. It's important. And Paul really understands the love that he is getting from this church in Philippi. But he also understands the attachment that he had with them, and now the detachment that is facing his life from them. And he's writing this letter to them to let them know that he's okay. That he's okay. He's trying to help them know that he's okay. And what were the things that have been happening to Paul? Well, let me just rehearse them for a moment. Paul had one desire in his heart in life. One great motive. And I think it was the overaching goal of everything that he ever dreamed of. And I don't know exactly all the reasons why. But there was one thing that Paul always wanted to do. And that was to go to Rome and preach the gospel. In fact, if you read Acts chapter 19 and verse 21, he says, after I've been to Jerusalem, I must also see Rome. In Romans chapter 1 verse 15, he says this, so as much as is in me, I am eager, I am ready to preach the gospel to those who are in Rome. And in Acts chapter 23 verse 11, we read, and the night following the Lord stood by him and said, be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome. And finally in Romans 1 verse 10, Paul prayed that he would have good speed, that his journey would be prospered when he came into Rome. He had no idea how he was going to get there. He wanted to go as a preacher, but he ended up going as a prisoner. What his ways were not God's ways. And what his timing was not God's timing. Now exactly when you look at this, he began to pray about going to Rome. He ended up going to Rome, but as I said, not the way that he expected him to go. And if you read the book of Acts, beginning in the 20th chapter, all the way through the 28th chapter, you discover that what happened to Paul began to happen to him when he came to Jerusalem. Because when he came to Jerusalem, according to the 21st chapter of Acts, he was warned that afflictions and imprisonments awaited him in the future. And even though Paul tried to assure the Jewish people in Jerusalem that he was being falsely accused by them, a nearly lynched mob, a religious lynched mob, tried to kill him. They tried to take his life. He ended up in a Roman prison, and he would be beaten there in the Roman prison. But for the fact that he pleaded that he was a Roman citizenship, he said, "You can't beat me because I am a Roman citizen." Everything about the circumstances of his imprisonment was a mockery and an injustice. He was insulted. He was shamed. He was kept in prison when he should have been released. And then there was the journey that happened to him on his way to Rome that many of us have read about. And if you've read the book of Acts, you remember that. There was a storm at sea with his life hanging in the balance, and he shipwrecked. Then he was bitten by a snake. And finally, when he did arrive in Rome, it was not as he had hoped at all. He came condemned in chains. He was placed in waiting for a full 2 years before he was able to stand before Caesar and even plead his case. And those are the things that happened to him. And that's what he meant in chapter 1 and verse 12, when he said, "I want to tell you about the things that happened to me." But in spite of all those things that happened to him, he was certain that all of the sorrow and all of the suffering very much was a part of God's plan for his life. And so when he writes to the Corinthians, he expresses in another context his whole mental attitude toward the difficulties in his life. So I would like for you to hold your place in Philippians and go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10. I want you to see this verse because this is the theme verse that I want you to actually memorize. I want you to meditate on this verse because when you start facing adversities, when you start facing difficulties, when you start facing persecution, when you start facing trials, when you start facing times in your life when you feel like you can't go on any further, and there are times that we're going to feel those moments, I want you to think about this verse. I want you to think about this key verse that's for every believer to mark down in our mental notebook. This is the key to Paul's comprehension of difficulties in the time of his life, in the troubles of his life. So listen to what he says. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10, he says this, "Therefore I take pleasure in my infirmities, in my reproaches, in my needs or necessities, in my persecutions, in my distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." This is Paul's testimony of everything that he was going through in his life. And I think about that verse there. The words here in this text, which are translated, "take pleasure," these words mean to think well. So when you see that, therefore I take pleasure, what he's saying is this: I think well. In other words, what Paul is saying is this: when I have my infirmities, when I have my reproaches, when I have my persecutions, when I have my trials, when I have my bad hair days, amen? When I wake up in the morning and things just aren't starting out right, when I'm having these difficulties, I think well. I have a positive attitude even toward my difficulties in my life, because I understand that behind all of these things, God is at work. Amen? That is what Paul is saying. And when I am weak, says Paul, God often is the strongest one between the two of us. Amen? How many of you have found that to be true in your very own life? When you're going through the difficulties, you think, I don't know what to do. I don't know how I'm going to get through this. I don't know how I'm going to pay this bill. I don't know how I'm going to share what I need to share with somebody that's going through what they're going through. I don't know how I'm going to deal with my family. I don't know how I'm going to deal with my friends. I don't know. When we're going through those difficult times, it's those times. And what Paul is saying to us in that verse, I want you to memorize it. As we go through this series, and as you face adversities, just like Dave Dravecky did in his own life, when you face those adversities, I want you to know, if we rely and we think well, we can feel, all of a sudden, we can feel the almighty, everlasting arms of God coming underneath us and just show us himself as to be the strong one on our behalf. You know, the fact of the matter is, folks, that when we face trouble, when we face detachments, though we can't control those circumstances, we can control about the way we think and what is happening to us. It's the attitude, it's the mental perception of how things approach us, how things happen in our lives. Well, if you follow through the argument Paul gives here in the first chapter, beginning in verse 12, he talks about adversity. And he literally gives us, in the context of this chapter, several reasons for a positive outlook. And we're going to talk just about one of them today, and then we'll finish up the rest of them next week. We'll finish up 6 of them next week. But I wanted to give you the basics of this sermon this morning, and then finish it up next week. I want you to know about how the things that have happened to us and you and that have happened to Paul here in this situation, what he's experienced. And watch this. Here was a man who was in prison, and he's writing a letter to the Philippians, who are his beloved friends, who are his closest friends. And he says, I want you to know about these things that have happened to me. Of course, they already knew about all the bad things that had happened to him. But Paul says, I don't want you to worry about it, because I want to tell you all the good news that has come out of the bad news. Now let's watch carefully as we study this together, not only today, but as we finish it up next week, the 7 things that were good that came out of Paul's bad, or Paul's adversity. And remember what he said, church. Remember, he said that in all these things, he tries to think well. He tries to think well and understands that all of these things that are happening to him, and that's why he could write later on, he could write for all things, the good and the bad, work together for good to them that love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. That's why he could write those words, because of what he had done. He was thinking well, because he understands that in his times of weakness, that is when God is strong. So the very first thing that we see right off the bat, which I think is awesome, is the very first one I want you to see, and that is that adversity that Paul was experiencing always, if we think well, can promote the progress of the gospel. Because I look at verse 12 of Philippians and I think about what he says here. He says in this verse, "But I would you should understand, brethren," I want you to know that you understand, brethren, the things which happened unto me have served unto the furtherance of the gospel, or have fallen out, rather, unto the furtherance of the gospel. And we see these words that he says here, and what he's saying is that the adversity to the church of Philippi, he's saying the adversity that I've gone through, the problems, the difficulties, all of these things that I'm going through have furthered the gospel. Now, here's the thing you got to keep in mind. How many of you in this room, I don't want to see your hand, but how many of you in this room have thought in your life, I'm going to do it this way, this is what I want to do, this is what how I want to do it, and then God comes along and He changes things, and you find yourself later down the road going, what just happened? I thought I had it my way, I thought I was doing it and then all of a sudden things have changed, and you're doing it the way God wants you to do it. And that's exactly where Paul is. He wanted to go to Rome to preach the gospel. He wanted to have his freedom to be able to go and to walk the streets and to go into any building that he wanted to go into and share the gospel of Jesus Christ. And think about it. Paul's life has been changed drastically for the love of Christ. You know, someone who hated Christians, someone who persecuted Christians because of what they believed in. It has now come full circle for him, and now he's a true believer in Jesus Christ. And he just wants to share that with anybody, but Rome was something that was on his heart. I don't know why, but it was something on his heart. That was his ambition, that was his goal, and he wanted to go there and share the gospel. He had no idea. He was going to go to Rome. But it wasn't the way he thought it was going to be. So he finds himself shackled 24 hours a day. 24 hours, 7 days a week. Shackled to a guard. They had one guard come in every 4 hours, change shifts. And he was shackled to them all the time. And you're probably sitting there saying, how in the world was he able to preach the gospel? Well, think about it, folks. How would you like to be chained to the Apostle Paul for 4 hours every day? Think about it. And Paul says, even in all of this, I find myself. And the term here, furtherance, look at it in that word there. This is what just hit me this week as I was studying this. The word here, furtherance, in the text, that is a Greek word which means literally to cut toward. It is a military term used by engineers who are preparing a road for the advancing army, and their preparation is in the process of removing any kind of obstruction such as rocks or trees or anything. And what Paul is saying is this: I want to tell you how all these things that have happened to me have literally removed barriers that stood in my way for the advancement of the gospel. Isn't that interesting? As he puts it that way. It's like Paul is standing here today instead of me. He's standing here today and he's speaking to us and he's saying this: Emmanuel Baptist, I'm stressing to you that even in the messes of dark threads that the recent years have woven into the pattern of my own life, all of my animosities, all of my bodily pains, all of the lies that have been against me, the misrepresentations and the deceitfulness against me, the miscarriage of justice, these chains that hold me prisoner, the mental turmoil of not getting a chance to even appeal my sentence, the nearness of death and the loss of hope, and the triumph of wickedness that surrounds me and the continued suppression of the truth. I have taken it all. I have taken it all. And I stood tall and did it my way. No, that's not what he said. I don't know why that happened, but it did. In seriousness, I've taken it all. I've looked it right in the face. And I want to tell others about Jesus even more. That's what Paul was saying. He's saying, I want to take these adversities and I want to change them. And I want to look at it the right way. And I want to think of them as well and as truth. And not in the way that you and I often do with our adversities. Dave Dravecky, in the prime of his career, after making a major comeback from a removal of a tumor that was on his arm, made a great comeback, worked hard to get back. And I don't know if you heard it well, but one of his coaches sat down with him and he could not believe. You see, this is how Satan works, isn't it? In a little bit, Dave Dravecky walks out in the bullpen and he hears all of the cheers and all of the crowd going nuts because they're just in awe that this man has made this comeback. And you know how quickly that can start feeding our minds the wrong way? That's exactly what was going on with Dave Dravecky. And his coach set him down. He said, Dave, it's not about all of this. Don't lose focus of what God is trying to do. He's trying to take your adversity. He's trying to take your situation and he wants to use it for his glory. Don't lose sight of that. And then just a few hours later, as he's pitching a pitch, the final pitch of his career, his arm snaps and he's laying on the ground. And that's the first thing he thinks of. The words of his coach. And he went through a depression. He went through anger. He went through different things, but then God brought him out by bringing good friends into his life. God brought him out of that. And now, over 700 appearances worldwide, he has shared his story. He shared his faith. You see, that's what Paul is trying to say here. He's saying this, that all things, the good and the bad, can work together for our good if we allow them to and we think well of it. So number one, I want you to remember is that verse in 2 Corinthians. Remember that verse, folks. When things happen to us, and they're going to, I know some of you have been going through some very tough times here recently. Health-wise, it just seems it's been hitting our church very hard. Just bad things happening. Remember I told you, when one of us hurt, we should all hurt. When one of us rejoices, we should all rejoice. That's the way God meant it to be. We're a community. But here's the thing what Paul's saying. He's saying, even in the midst of all of that, and what you've been going through, in the midst of adversity, sometimes we need to understand that God uses those adversities in all of our lives to promote the progress of the gospel. To break down any barrier. To get all them rocks and trees out of the way. So that his gospel can be presented. The other day, I had a long day. Then I went over and did a funeral. Got home, I was tired. It's just one of those days, I was tired. And all of a sudden, Leslie got a phone call, and we got called out to go to the hospital. Her cousin they didn't think he would make it through the night, and he didn't know the Lord. And so, his mother called us, wanted us to come and maybe talk to him about the Lord. When we got there, we prayed. When we got there, we started talking to him. He seemed like he was understanding what we were trying to say and what we were trying to tell him. But to me, it felt like his wife really didn't want us there. It felt like it was really, it was a tough situation. So we went back in the waiting room, we sat there, and then we left. The very next day, Leslie was called back out. She went out to go sit with them. It was the wife that asked her to come. The very next day, something else happened. He had to go back in for surgery. And they called me. And they wanted me to come up and pray with the family. So I went up and I prayed with the family. And not only was it very receptive to what I had to pray and what I had to say, but she was there, his wife, her son was there. A lot of great things happened. God is working in the midst of adversity. And his wife looked at me when I was sitting there, and she said, no matter what happens with this, when it's all done, I would like to start coming up to your church. Folks, that's how God works. That's what God does. And here's the thing. Even in the midst of adversities or situations or problems, if we just allow God to use us and we think well, the furtherance of the gospel can be spread.